The single-handedly most expensive part that we have for this car so far, which is here, has arrived, has been purchased, doesn't fit. Let me explain. This is a transmission from an R33 Skyline with the transfer case that we need to run the all-wheel drive system. Now, why doesn't it fit? See this piece here, the input shaft and all the splines around it?
It's vastly different from the Ford transmission with less splines.
Now that's not a huge concern of mine because they have different clutches out there, they have swap kits, but they don't have one for this transmission to this engine, as I've talked about before. I've mentioned in a couple videos before, we're taking the front cover of the GTR transmission, cutting the bell housing off, and then mounting it to this. This piece of it, after having the transmission, doesn't work either. Let me show you why. Now, normally the way that the T5 transmission would fit in here is this piece on the T5, which is where the throwout bearing rides, would sit somewhere right in here, not fully up against the back of the clutch, but somewhere pretty close to it. Now the input shaft that sticks out past this with the splines for the clutch and then the piece that goes into the pilot bearing are very similar links to where I think that side of it will work. However, the throwout bearing piece on the T5 is a lot longer to clear the bell housing, which if you set this here, ends up somewhere behind this plate, which would be inside of our transmission, which obviously doesn't work. The idea is to make this longer. We can make a custom one of these or something and make this longer. The problem that imposes is now you need a longer input shaft to extend past this. If this is an extra inch long, now you need to extend the input shaft another inch. And getting a custom input shaft is near impossible, and if we can do it, incredibly expensive. Probably asking, well, what is the solution to this problem? We have two main options: use the T5 that came with the Mustang or use the GTR transmission. To use the T5, all we have to do is make a simple shaft with the splines for the output of the T5 and the input of the transfer case. At that point, either somehow find a way to mate them with a new back housing for the T5 transmission or some kind of casing that just clamps around the both of them, or just mount the transfer case separately in the right spot. Fairly simple, just the cost of that shaft is pretty much all it would take. The other option is use the actual transmission and adapt it to this motor some way, somehow. Now, right off the bat, we're using the GTR transmission. I'm selling the T5 transmission tomorrow, so we don't even have that option. Now, to some, that may sound very stupid because it eliminates basically our backup option for one of the biggest parts of this build. But for some reason, the build just wouldn't feel right if I didn't use the entire transmission. So we've established we're using the GTR transmission. How do we do that? I've taken some measurements, and like I said earlier, I think the piece of the input shaft that sticks out past the throwout bearing sleeve, that part is gonna work. We just have to make this long enough and have this also kind of attached to it so that it works with the bell housing. After many hours, the transmission is mostly kind of sitting on the back of the block. The input shaft is sitting in the pilot bearing. So some quick math. The bell housing on the Mustang that came with it is 8 inches long, roughly. It might be like 8 1/4, but it's roughly 8 inches. Which means from the back of the block to whatever front cover we have on the transmission has to be 8 inches. On the GTR transmission, we have about 6 inches to work with. We can already go ahead and knock off a whole inch of that because those transmissions actually had a longer input shaft. I can't remember the reason, I looked it up one time. But the Fox bodies have the same bell housing because they have the same motor, and they're an inch shorter. The first way we're gonna do that, where we gain about 1/4 of an inch, is not pushing the transmission all the way into the block. Recess where the pilot bearing goes is deeper than the actual needle bearings of the pilot bearing. So if we don't push it all the way in the block and we stick it out a little bit, we can gain most 1/4 of an inch, but we're gonna roughly say about 1/8 of an inch. So now all we have to make up is 7/8. Now the easiest way to do that is on the back of the T5 bell housing. We're gonna have to make some notches for some of the front cover that we make for this transmission, just to allow some of the shift linkages to fit in. Other than that, what I think we can do, we can actually shave down the front and the back of the bell housing to hopefully gain the other 7/8. Now, the obvious concern with that is you're taking away material, which is probably gonna weaken it, but these bell housings aren't really known to crack or break, at least at this horsepower level that we're at, and I would much rather go with that trade-off versus the trade-off of putting the old transmission back in it. This is gonna be the start of an incredibly long journey, just like with the rest of the car. However, when it comes to transmission stuff, the amount of precision you have to have, you know, making control arms and stuff like that, you can dial it in. It can be a little off, but the precision that a transmission has is something that I didn't think we were gonna have to mess with. I think I'm calling it for this video. I think it's about to rain, so I need to get everything back inside the garage. But I wanted to show you guys that we have a transmission, we have a transfer case. Things are moving along real quick. There's gonna be a video coming. I think one of the next videos we do, we have to mock the engine up in the car because that determines where our front diff goes, which determines some of our front suspension placement. Other than that, the fact that we have a transmission, which is the most expensive part of this build so far, and the fact that I spent all day yesterday thinking I was gonna have to return it, it's pretty exciting to see that we potentially have a solution. Also, if anybody has any information about pilot bearings, does that have to be the same size, or is it fine that there's like a little bit of wiggle room between the shaft and the pilot bearing? I know there's a reason that they have those pilot bearings on the back, and it's not just held on by the bell housing. I think it has to do something with just the way things flex, and it's an extra support for the transmission shaft. But I don't know the consequences of having a shaft that's a little bit smaller than the bearing. Also, if we mock up the front drive shaft, this is comically too small. Now, I think on the GTRs, the front diff sits like in the middle of the motor, and then because that's kind of where the front axle sits, which same thing in this one. The front axle kind of, not that it has an axle, but the front control arms and the wheels kind of line up right here with the hump of the motor. Obviously our diff is going to be way up there, so have to get that extended, but I just thought that was funny how small it was compared to how much more room we need. We almost need two of them, really. The only other concern with this is obviously being where the clutch sits. So the clutch obviously sits right against the face of the flywheel, which if we don't put the transmission all the way in, there's this little bit that sticks out, and then the splines start. Although the clutch may be thin, but the actual engagement of the splines is about an inch. And based off some measurements, we should have about 3/4 of an inch of clutch spline engagement, which is not ideal. You'd like to use more, but I think it'll be enough again for this power level. I'm hoping that eventually with this build, we can go back and make some even more crazy custom stuff and get that engagement a little bit better. We'll probably need to when we have more power anyways, so. But for now, I think it's fine. And that's gonna call it for today. I'm sure there's a million different measurements that I'm missing, so if there's something that was confusing to you and you need some information, comment down below and I will definitely respond as quick as I can and get those measurements for you. If there's stuff that I'm not thinking of, if there's any transmission people out there and there's something glaring that I'm not noticing, definitely let me know, because this is a make it or break it part, because if this doesn't work, we basically don't have a drivetrain. Definitely look out for some more big videos to come. This is definitely a big milestone. And I think tonight I'm gonna be mocking up the engine, so that'll probably be one of the next videos you see. That's exciting. Other than that, I'll see you guys in the next one.